Chapter 1, The Turning Point. Brian Jenson had never been a man who enjoyed confrontation. For most of his 32 years, he'd been the guy who smoothed things over, who swallowed his pride for the sake of peace. But that day, 2 years ago, something inside him snapped like a frayed guitar string. His ex-wife stood in his living room, arms crossed, lips pursed in that familiar expression of superiority. The same look she wore when she told him she was leaving him for her boss. The same look she wore when she explained, with clinical detachment, that she deserved to be happy. Now, she was here again, lecturing him about how to be a better father. "You need to set a better example for Gina," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "She needs stability, Brian. She needs—" He raised a hand, calm but firm. "Stop." She blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" "Stop," he repeated, his voice even, almost gentle. "You don't get to do this anymore." Her brows knitted. "Do what? Lecture me? Judge me? Pretend you're the authority on what makes a good father or a good man?" He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of years pressing against his ribs. "You forfeited that right the day you blew up our family." Her mouth opened, but he didn't give her the chance. "You don't get to decide if I'm enough," he said, his tone sharpening like a blade. "Your opinion? Less than worthless." Color rose in her cheeks. "Brian." He held up both hands, palms out, like a man calming a wild animal. "Before you say what I know you're about to say, before you threaten me, let me make something clear." He stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "You have a little power over me right now, but it's not the power you think you have." She scoffed. "You think I'm afraid of you?" He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Afraid? No. Honestly." He tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle he'd finally solved. "I pity you." Her eyes narrowed. "Why the hell would I need your pity?" He smiled, slow and deliberate. "Because our daughter isn't going to be a child forever. One day she'll be an adult. And when that day comes, I'm telling her everything you did to destroy our family." Her face drained of color. "You wouldn't." His smile widened. "I was always going to tell her the truth. That's what love looks like. And I'm not going to let whatever lies you were planning to feed her stand. You, and only you, are going to have to explain why you broke her family. It's not my job to protect you from your choices." Her breath hitched. He could see the panic flicker behind her eyes. "So," he continued, his voice calm as a surgeon's hand, "the next time you come over here thinking you have the right to lecture me about anything, that's fine. Just remember, the day is coming when you're going to need to explain yourself." He stepped back, his gaze locking on hers with a quiet intensity that made her flinch. "Now, unless there's something else, you can leave. And don't come back. We're not friends. We're not family. We're two people who share a kid." Silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out. That was the last time she invaded his house with attitude. 2 years later, his life was peaceful. No drama, no lectures, just work, his daughter, and the quiet satisfaction of surviving hell. Tonight, he was walking home from the park after his evening jog. The air was crisp, the streetlights flickering on as dusk settled like a soft blanket. The park was nearly empty. Just a few stragglers, a jogger pounding the pavement, and a woman sitting on a bench beneath a lamppost. Beside her sat a dented suitcase. Her clothes were worn, her posture rigid with exhaustion. A little girl, bundled in a pink puffy coat, leaned against her, whining softly. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Brian slowed, his chest tightening. He knew that look, the hollow-eyed desperation of someone clinging to the last thread of hope. It was the same look he wore the night his world collapsed. He stopped. For reasons he couldn't explain, his feet refused to keep moving. He approached slowly, hands visible, voice gentle. "Excuse me." The woman stiffened, her eyes darting to him like a cornered animal. "My name's Brian," he said, keeping his tone calm. "I'm a divorced single dad, and I know that look on your face." He nodded toward the suitcase, the child. "You need help." Her chin lifted, defiant even in defeat. "I'm fine." He smiled faintly. "You're sitting on a park bench at dusk with a suitcase and a hungry kid. You're not fine." He took a breath. "Listen, I promise I'm not a threat. I'm just a guy who's walked down a similar road. I don't know your story, and I don't need to if you don't want to share. But it's cold, and it's supposed to rain tonight. Let me help you." Her eyes flickered with fear, indecision, pride. Then she glanced at her daughter, and he saw it. Hopelessness, the kind that eats you alive. Brian pulled out his wallet and phone, holding them out like peace offerings. "Here's my driver's license. And here." He swiped through his photo gallery, showing pictures of him and Gina at the zoo, at the park, grinning with ice cream cones. "That's my little girl. I'm not some creep. I have 2 extra rooms sitting empty. Please, let me help you get your daughter off the streets, at least for tonight." The woman stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. "I'll pay you back," she whispered. Brian shook his head. "Don't worry about that. Helping someone in need, that's its own kind of reward." As they walked toward his car, Brian felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Chapter 2, A Stranger Under His Roof. Brian wasn't sure what surprised him more. The fact that he'd just invited a stranger into his home, or how natural it felt. He wasn't reckless by nature. Careful, cautious, methodical, that was him. But as he drove through the quiet streets with Lena and her daughter in the back seat, he felt oddly calm. The little girl, Maddie, Lena had whispered, was curled up against her mother, fast asleep. Her pink coat looked too thin for January, and her shoes were scuffed to the point of surrender. Brian glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Lena's profile in the dim glow of passing streetlights. She was staring out the window, her jaw tight, her hands clasped around Maddie like a lifeline. He cleared his throat softly. "You okay back there?" Her eyes flicked to his in the mirror, wary. "Fine." He smiled faintly. "That's the same fine I used to give people when my life was falling apart." Her lips pressed together, but she didn't answer. Brian didn't push. He knew that tone, that brittle edge of pride. He'd worn it himself once, like armor against pity. When they pulled into his driveway, a modest two-story with a porch light glowing like a beacon, Lena's grip on Maddie tightened. Brian noticed. He slowed his movements, speaking gently. "This is it," he said, cutting the engine. "Not fancy, but it's warm and dry." Lena hesitated before opening the door. Maddie stirred, murmuring something incoherent. Brian walked around to help, but Lena was already lifting her daughter with surprising strength for someone so thin. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and laundry detergent. Brian had always kept things neat, partly because he liked order, partly because chaos reminded him of the past. "You can put her on the couch for now," he said, gesturing toward the living room. "I'll grab some blankets." Lena nodded, her eyes scanning the space like a soldier entering enemy territory. Brian disappeared down the hall, returning with a stack of soft throws. "She'll be more comfortable in a bed," he said, setting the blankets down. "I've got 2 guest rooms upstairs. You can take whichever." Lena's throat worked as if swallowing words. "You didn't have to do this." Brian shrugged lightly. "Maybe not, but I wanted to." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, searching, skeptical, before she looked away. 10 minutes later, Maddie was tucked into a guest bed, her tiny frame swallowed by a comforter. Lena stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her daughter breathe. Brian leaned against the wall, giving her space. "She's out cold," he said softly. Lena nodded. "She hasn't slept in a real bed for a while." Brian didn't ask how long. He could guess. "Come downstairs," he said gently. "You look like you could use something hot." In the kitchen, Brian poured 2 mugs of tea. He slid one toward her and sat across the table. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, Lena spoke. "Why are you doing this?" Brian met her eyes. "Because I know what it feels like to think the world's done with you." Her brow furrowed. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I know that look. I wore it for months after my divorce." Her lips parted slightly, curiosity flickering despite herself. "Divorced? 2 years ago," he said. "Messy. Ugly. The kind of breakup that makes you question everything about yourself." Lena stared into her tea. "Sounds familiar." Brian didn't press. He let the quiet settle, then smiled faintly. "You don't have to tell me your story tonight, or ever if you don't want to. Just know you're safe here." Her throat tightened. He could see it, the battle between pride and gratitude. "I'll find a way to pay you back," she murmured. Brian shook his head. "Don't worry about that right now." They sat in silence for a while, sipping tea. Brian studied her in the soft kitchen light. She was pretty, not in the polished magazine cover way his ex-wife had been, but in a quiet, unassuming way. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, her clothes worn, but her eyes were fierce. He liked that. The sound of a phone vibrating broke the moment. Brian glanced at the counter. His heart sank when he saw the name flashing on the screen. "Melissa, of course," he answered, keeping his voice neutral. "Hello, Brian." Her tone was sharp, like a blade. "Gina just told me you picked up some woman and her kid from the park. Is that true?" Brian closed his eyes briefly. "Melissa, it's none of your business. None of my, are you insane? You don't know this woman. You have our daughter in that house." "She's not here," Brian said evenly. "And even if she were, I'm capable of making decisions without your approval." Melissa scoffed. "You're reckless. This is exactly why." "Melissa." His voice cut through hers like steel. "Stop. Silence. You don't get to lecture me anymore," he said, calm but firm. "Not about my choices. Not about my life. That ended 2 years ago." On the other end, Melissa sputtered, but Brian didn't give her the satisfaction of a fight. He ended the call, setting the phone down with deliberate care. When he looked up, Lena was watching him from the doorway, eyes wide. "Sorry," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "My ex. She likes to think she still runs the show." Lena's lips curved, just slightly. "Sounds like you handled it." Brian chuckled. "Let's just say I've had practice." Later, as he showed her to the second guest room, Lena paused in the hallway. "Brian." He turned. "Thank you." she said softly. For tonight. He smiled. Get some rest. Tomorrow will look better. As he walked back to his own room, Brian felt something unexpected. A sense of purpose. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel empty. And he wasn't sure if that scared him or thrilled him. Chapter 3, The First Sparks. Brian woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, because no one had brewed coffee in his kitchen except him for the past 2 years. He rolled out of bed, ran a hand through his hair, and padded down the hall. The sight that greeted him in the kitchen stopped him cold. Lena stood at the counter, wearing an oversized hoodie that probably belonged to him, her hair pulled into a messy bun. Maddie sat at the table, swinging her legs and coloring on a scrap of paper. The morning light streamed through the window, painting everything in soft gold. For a second, Brian just stared. His house didn't feel empty anymore. Felt alive. Morning, Lena said without turning, her voice cautious but warmer than last night. Morning, Brian replied, clearing his throat. You didn't have to make coffee. She glanced over her shoulder, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You had beans. I figured it was safe. Brian chuckled. Safe is good. He moved to the table, ruffling Maddie's hair gently. Hey, kiddo. She looked up, big brown eyes blinking at him. Hi. Brian grinned. You like pancakes? Her face lit up like a Christmas tree. Yes. Good, Brian said, rolling up his sleeves. Because I make the best pancakes in the state. Lena arched a brow. That's a bold claim. Brian smirked. Stick around. You'll see. As he whisked batter, Lena leaned against the counter, watching him. There was something soothing about the rhythm of his movements, the easy confidence, the way he hummed under his breath. You do this a lot? She asked. Every other weekend, he said. When Gina's here. Her expression softened. Your daughter. Yep. He flipped a pancake with a flourish. 5 years old. Smart as a whip. Bossy as a CEO. Lena smiled faintly. Sounds like Maddie. Brian glanced at Maddie, who was now humming to herself as she colored. Kids have a way of keeping us humble. Lena's gaze dropped. Yeah. Brian sensed the shadow in her tone but didn't pry. Instead, he slid a plate of pancakes onto the table. Breakfast is served. Maddie attacked her stack like a tiny warrior. Brian laughed, pouring syrup for her. You're a lifesaver, Lena murmured, sitting down slowly. Brian shrugged. Just a guy with a griddle. Half an hour later, the kitchen was filled with laughter. Maddie giggling at Brian's exaggerated pancake flipping tricks. Lena smiling despite herself. For the first time since she walked into his house, her shoulders seemed to relax. Brian noticed, and he liked it. The doorbell rang. Brian froze. He knew that ring. Gina, he said under his breath, wiping his hands. When he opened the door, his daughter barreled into him like a tiny hurricane. Daddy. Brian scooped her up, grinning. Hey, Peanut. Behind her stood Melissa, arms crossed, eyes sharp as knives. Melissa, Brian said evenly. She scanned the living room, her gaze landing on Lena and Maddie at the table. Her lips curled. So it's true. Brian set Gina down gently. Melissa, not now. Not now. Her voice dripped venom. You bring strangers into your home and my daughter is here. Melissa. Brian's tone was steel. Enough. Gina tugged his sleeve. Daddy. Who's that? Brian crouched, smiling at her. That's Maddie. She's staying with us for a little while. Gina's eyes lit up. Can we play? Brian chuckled. After breakfast. Melissa bristled. Brian. He straightened, meeting her glare head-on. Melissa, you can leave now. Her mouth opened, but Brian's expression silenced her. After a tense beat, she spun on her heel and stalked off. Brian exhaled slowly, closing the door. When he turned, Lena was watching him, eyes wide. Sorry about that, he said, rubbing his neck. My ex. She has a talent for drama. Lena's lips curved into a wry smile. I gathered. The rest of the morning was chaos, the good kind. Gina and Maddie bonded instantly, turning the living room into a fortress of pillows and crayons. Brian and Lena ended up on the couch, sipping coffee and watching the girls giggle. They're like twins, Brian said, amused. Lena smiled softly. Maddie hasn't laughed like that in weeks. Brian glanced at her, something warm stirring in his chest. Then I'd say today's a win. For the first time in years, Brian felt something he thought he'd lost. Hope. Chapter 4, Trouble Brewing. Brian had expected the morning's drama with Melissa to be the peak of tension for the day. He was wrong. By late afternoon, the house was a whirlwind of crayons, stuffed animals, and giggles. Gina and Maddie had declared themselves best friends forever, and were now staging a puppet show in the living room. Brian sat on the couch, sipping coffee, while Lena folded the blankets they'd used the night before. For a moment, everything felt normal, warm, almost domestic. Then his phone buzzed. Brian glanced at the screen and groaned inwardly. Melissa. Again. He debated ignoring it, but experience told him that would only make things worse. He answered, keeping his tone neutral. Melissa. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Brian, what the hell is going on over there? He pinched the bridge of his nose. Melissa, I told you this morning. You told me nothing. Gina just called me and said there's another kid in the house. And some woman. Are you out of your mind? Brian exhaled slowly, forcing calm into his voice. Melissa, I'm helping someone who needed it. That's all. That's all. Her laugh was bitter. You don't know her. You don't know what kind of person she is. For all you know, she could be dangerous. Brian's jaw tightened. Melissa, stop. No, I will not stop. You're reckless, Brian. This is exactly why. Melissa. His voice dropped, steel threading through every syllable. You don't get to lecture me anymore. Not about my choices. Not about my life. That ended 2 years ago. Silence crackled on the line. You think you can just… I think, Brian said evenly, that you need to remember something. We're not married. We're not friends. We're two people who share a child. That's it. Melissa sputtered, but Brian didn't give her the satisfaction of a fight. Gina's safe. Always. That's all you need to know. He ended the call and set the phone down with deliberate care. When he looked up, Lena was standing in the doorway, eyes wide. Sorry, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. My ex. She has a talent for drama. Lena's lips curved into a wry smile. I gathered. Later, as the girls played, Brian and Lena found themselves in the kitchen again. He was rinsing dishes. She was drying them. Felt oddly easy. She doesn't like me? Lena said suddenly, her tone light but edged with something deeper. Brian chuckled. Melissa doesn't like anyone who isn't Melissa. Lena smirked. Sounds exhausting. You have no idea. He handed her a plate, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact was small, accidental, but it sent a flicker of heat through him. He cleared his throat, focusing on the sink. Sorry about the phone call. I didn't want you to feel awkward. Lena shrugged, though her eyes softened. You didn't have to defend me. Brian looked at her then. Really looked. I wasn't defending you. I was defending my right to make my own choices. Her breath caught just slightly. The sound of laughter from the living room broke the moment. Maddie and Gina were now wearing pillowcases as capes, declaring themselves superheroes. Brian grinned. Looks like we've got a crime-fighting duo. Lena laughed. A real laugh, warm and unguarded. Brian felt it like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel like a reminder of what he'd lost. It felt like a glimpse of what he might find. But as Brian watched Lena smile, a thought crept in, quiet, unwelcome. Melissa wasn't going to let this go, and he had a sinking feeling the storm was just beginning. Chapter 5, Shared Vulnerabilities. The house was quiet now. Maddie and Gina had finally collapsed after an afternoon of superhero adventures, sprawled across the couch like tiny warriors who'd conquered the world. Brian draped a blanket over them, smiling at the way their capes, pillowcases, still clung to their shoulders. He turned and found Lena standing in the doorway, arms folded loosely, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. They wore themselves out, she said, her voice low, almost tender. Brian nodded. That's the magic of 5-year-olds. They burn bright and crash hard. Lena smiled faintly, then glanced toward the kitchen. Mind if I sit for a bit? Not at all, Brian said, gesturing toward the table. I'll make coffee. Minutes later, they sat across from each other, mugs steaming between them. The silence wasn't awkward this time, it was heavy, but in a way that felt honest. Lena traced the rim of her cup with one finger. You're good with them, she said finally. Brian shrugged. Kids are easy. Adults, not so much. Her lips curved wryly. True. He studied her for a moment, then spoke gently. You don't have to tell me anything, Lena, but if you want to, I'll listen. Her throat worked as if swallowing words. For a long moment, he thought she'd stay silent. Then, slowly, she exhaled. I didn't plan on ending up on a park bench, she said, her voice brittle. I had a job, place. Then, things fell apart. Brian didn't interrupt. He knew how hard it was to peel back those layers. My ex, she continued, her jaw tightening. He was charming, until he wasn't. When I left, I thought I'd be okay. But rent's high, jobs are scarce, and Maddie. Her voice cracked. She deserves better than this. Brian's chest tightened. He remembered that feeling, the crushing weight of failure, the fear of not being enough. You're doing your best, he said softly. Her laugh was bitter. My best landed us on a park bench. Brian leaned forward, his gaze steady. No, your best got her through it. She's safe. She's loved. That matters. Lena blinked, and for a moment, he saw the fight drain from her eyes. What about you? She asked quietly. You said your divorce was messy. Brian's jaw flexed. Melissa cheated. With her boss. I didn't see it coming. One day I had a family. The next, nothing. Lena's eyes softened. I'm sorry. He shrugged, though the ache still lingered. I spent months wondering what I did wrong. Turns out, sometimes people break things just because they can. Silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. Two broken people, sitting in a kitchen, sharing truths they hadn't spoken aloud in years. Brian smiled faintly. You know what helped? What? Pancakes. Lena blinked, then laughed. A real laugh, warm and unguarded. Pancakes. Yep. He grinned. When everything feels like hell, make pancakes. It's hard to cry when you're flipping batter. Her laughter lingered, softening the edges of the room. Brian felt it like sunlight breaking through clouds. They talked for another hour about nothing and everything. Childhood memories, favorite movies, the weird comfort of late-night infomercials. By the time Lena stood to check on Maddie, Brian realized something startling. He liked her voice. He liked her laugh. He liked the way she looked at him. Not like Melissa had, with judgment and expectation, but with something quieter, something real. And for the first time in years, Brian wondered if maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over. Chapter 6, The Comedy of Co-Parenting. Brian had learned 2 things about 5-year-olds. 1. They have more energy than a nuclear reactor. 2. When they team up, chaos is inevitable. By mid-morning, Gina and Maddie had transformed his living room into what could only be described as a cross between a daycare and a battlefield. Pillows were stacked like fortresses. Dolls were lined up as soldiers. And someone, he suspected Maddie, had taped a handwritten sign to the TV that read, "No boys allowed, except Daddy." Brian stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, surveying the carnage. I feel like I should call FEMA. Lena, perched on the arm of the couch, smirked. You're the one who bragged about being good with kids. Brian grinned. I said I was good with 1 kid. 2 is advanced level. Before Lena could reply, Gina popped up from behind a pillow wall, wearing a tiara and holding a plastic sword. Daddy, we need snacks for the royal feast. Maddie appeared beside her, draped in a blanket like a cape. And juice. Lots of juice. Brian raised a brow. Royal feast, huh? What's the occasion? Gina puffed out her chest. We're superheroes and princesses. We saved the kingdom from the evil vacuum cleaner. Brian chuckled. Impressive. But superheroes and princesses need fuel. Pancakes again. Both girls squealed in unison. Yes. Brian shot Lena a look. You see what you started? She laughed. A warm, unguarded sound that made something in his chest tighten. Don't blame me. You're the pancake guy. 10 minutes later, the kitchen was a circus. Brian flipped pancakes while Maddie and Gina argued over who got the first one. Lena tried to referee, but the girls were relentless. Okay, Brian said, sliding a plate onto the table. First rule of Pancake Kingdom. No fighting in the royal court. Gina giggled. What's the second rule? Brian winked. The king gets the biggest pancake. Both girls gasped in mock outrage. Maddie pointed dramatically. That's not fair. Brian shrugged. Life isn't fair, kiddo. But pancakes make it better. Lena shook her head, laughing. You're terrible. Brian grinned. I prefer strategic. After breakfast, the girls decided the next adventure was a play-date wedding. Brian discovered this when he walked into the living room and found Maddie wearing a veil made from a dish towel while Gina hummed the wedding march. Brian blinked. What's happening? Gina beamed. Maddie's getting married. Brian raised a brow. To who? Gina pointed at him. You. Brian choked on air. Me? Maddie nodded solemnly. You're nice. And you make pancakes. Brian stared, then glanced at Lena, who was biting her lip so hard he thought she might draw blood. Her shoulders shook with suppressed laughter. Wow, Brian said slowly. That's flattering. But I think I'm a little old for Maddie. Gina frowned. Then marry her mommy. She pointed at Lena like a tiny matchmaker. The room went dead silent. Brian froze. Lena froze. Maddie clapped her hands. Brian cleared his throat, his ears burning. How about we just play superheroes again? Gina crossed her arms. Fine. But you'd make a cute couple. Brian muttered something about needing more coffee and fled to the kitchen, Lena's laughter trailing behind him like music. Later, when the girls were occupied with cartoons, Lena joined him in the kitchen, still smiling. Cute couple, huh? She teased, her voice soft but playful. Brian smirked, though his pulse ticked faster than he liked. Kids say the darndest things. Her eyes held his for a beat too long, something unspoken flickering there. Then she looked away, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Brian swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how quiet the house felt despite the giggles from the living room. And for the first time, the idea didn't seem as ridiculous as it had 5 minutes ago. Chapter 7, The X Strikes Back. Brian had just finished loading the dishwasher when the doorbell rang. He frowned. It was early evening, and he wasn't expecting anyone. From the living room came the sound of Maddie and Gina giggling over a cartoon, their laughter bright and innocent. Lena was curled up on the armchair, her legs tucked beneath her, a book resting in her lap. She looked up at him, brows lifting in silent question. I'll get it, Brian said, wiping his hands on a towel. When he opened the door, his stomach sank. Melissa. She stood on the porch like a storm cloud in heels, her arms crossed, her expression sharp enough to cut steel. Melissa, Brian said evenly, his voice calm but clipped. What do you want? Her eyes narrowed. We need to talk. Brian sighed. If this is about Gina, It's about her. Melissa jerked her chin toward the living room, where Lena's laughter floated faintly through the air. Brian's jaw tightened. Melissa? Who is she? Melissa demanded, stepping closer. What kind of woman moves into a man's house with a kid in tow? You don't even know her. Brian held up a hand, his tone firm. Stop. You don't get to interrogate me. Melissa's lips curled. You think I'm going to let some stranger play house with my daughter? Brian's voice dropped, calm but edged with steel. Gina is safe. Always. That's all you need to know. Melissa scoffed. Safe? You're reckless, Brian. This is exactly why. Melissa. His tone cut through hers like a blade. Enough. Her mouth snapped shut, fury flashing in her eyes. You don't get to control my life anymore, Brian said, his voice low, steady. Not who I help. Not who I let into my home. That ended 2 years ago. Melissa's jaw clenched. You're making a mistake. Brian smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Funny. That's what you said before you blew up our marriage. Her face flushed crimson. You think you're clever? I think, Brian said, his voice calm as a surgeon's hand, that you should leave before you embarrass yourself in front of the kids. Melissa stiffened, her nostrils flaring. For a moment he thought she'd explode, but then her gaze flicked past him and landed on Lena. Lena had stepped into the hallway, Maddie clinging to her leg. Her posture was calm, but her eyes were sharp, protective. Melissa's lips curled into a sneer. So this is her. Lena's chin lifted, her voice cool. I'm Lena. Melissa's smile was venomous. How sweet. Playing house with someone else's family. Brian felt the tension coil in his chest, ready to snap, but Lena beat him to it. I'm not playing anything, Lena said evenly. I'm just trying to keep my daughter warm and safe. Something you should understand. Melissa blinked, thrown off by the quiet strength in Lena's tone. Brian stepped forward, his voice calm but final. Melissa, leave. Now. For a long, charged moment, Melissa stared at him, her fury simmering. Then, with a sharp turn of her heel, she stalked down the walkway, her heels clicking like gunshots. Brian closed the door slowly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When he turned, Lena was watching him, her expression unreadable. Sorry about that, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. She doesn't handle change well. Lena's lips curved into a faint smile. You handled her. Brian chuckled, though his pulse was still racing. Let's just say I've had practice. Later, when the kids were tucked in and the house was quiet, Brian found Lena in the kitchen, rinsing a mug. You didn't have to defend me, she said softly, not looking at him. Brian leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. I wasn't defending you. I was defending my right to make my own choices. Her breath caught just slightly. She looked up, meeting his eyes. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, humming with something unspoken. Then Lena smiled faintly, breaking the tension. Well, thanks anyway. Brian smiled back, though his chest felt tight in a way he hadn't felt in years. And as he watched her walk away, one thought burned in his mind. Melissa wasn't done. But neither was he. Chapter 8. A date that wasn't. Brian hadn't planned on asking Lena out. In fact, he'd spent the entire morning convincing himself that it was a terrible idea. She was vulnerable. He was, well, him. 2 people with enough baggage to sink a cruise ship. But then she laughed. It was over something stupid. A joke about Maddie and Gina forming a superhero union and demanding better snack benefits. But the sound of it hit him like sunlight breaking through clouds. Warm. Unscripted. Real. And before he knew it, the words were out of his mouth. Want to grab dinner tonight? Lena blinked, startled. Dinner. Brian rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly aware of how insane this sounded. Yeah, food. At a place that isn't my kitchen. Her lips curved, amused. Is this a date? Brian hesitated. No. Yes, sort of. Not official. He groaned. Wow, that sounded smooth. Lena laughed again, and Brian decided he'd embarrass himself daily if it meant hearing that sound. Okay, she said softly. Dinner. They chose a small diner on the edge of town, neutral territory, casual enough to keep things from feeling like a rom-com cliché. Brian opened the door for her, and Lena gave him a look that was half gratitude, half disbelief. You're really doing the gentleman thing? She teased. Brian grinned. I'm old-fashioned. Sue me. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and fried comfort food. They slid into a booth, menus in hand. So, Lena said, scanning the options. What's good here? Brian smirked. Everything that'll clog your arteries. She chuckled. Perfect. They ordered burgers and milkshakes because if you're going to break the ice, you might as well break your diet too. Conversation flowed easier than Brian expected. They talked about movies, music, the weird quirks of small-town life. Then Lena asked the question he'd been dreading. Why did you really invite me? Brian froze, his straw halfway to his mouth. Because you looked like you could use a night out? Her brow arched. That's sweet. But not the whole truth. Brian sighed, setting the straw down. Okay, the truth? I like talking to you, and I like how you make the house feel less empty. Lena's eyes softened, but her voice was cautious. Brian, I don't want to be a burden. He leaned forward, his gaze steady. You're not. Trust me. I know what a burden feels like. You're the opposite. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged, humming with something unspoken. Of course, that's when the universe decided to intervene. The waitress appeared with their food, breaking the moment like a sledgehammer. Brian forced a smile, thanking her, but inside he was cursing fate for its lousy timing. Still, as they dug into their burgers, the tension eased into something lighter, comfortable even. Lena laughed at his terrible jokes. Brian teased her about dipping fries in her milkshake. And for the first time in years, Brian felt normal. Not broken. Not bitter. Just a man having dinner with a woman who made him want to believe in second chances. When they left the diner, the night air was cool, the sky scattered with stars. Brian walked Lena to the car, his hands shoved in his pockets to keep from doing something stupid, like reaching for hers. Thanks, she said softly. For tonight. Brian smiled. Anytime. She hesitated, then added, it was nice. He nodded, his chest tight in a way he hadn't felt in years. Yeah, it was. As he watched her climb into the car, one thought burned in his mind. This wasn't a date, but it felt like the start of something that could be. Chapter 9, The Confession. Brian had never been good at sleeping after a night like that. The diner, the laughter, the way Lena's eyes softened when he told her she wasn't a burden. It all replayed in his head like a movie he didn't want to end. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering when his life had gone from quiet survival to this. A woman in his guest room, two little girls giggling like they'd known each other forever, and him, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. By morning, he'd decided one thing: he needed clarity. The day started like any other. Pancakes, because apparently, that was now tradition, cartoons, and Maddie and Gina plotting their next adventure. Brian and Lena moved around each other in the kitchen like they'd been doing it for years, passing plates, sharing smiles, brushing fingers accidentally on purpose. But Brian couldn't shake the weight in his chest. He wanted to say something. Needed to. When the girls ran off to build a castle out of couch cushions, Brian seized the moment. Lena, he said quietly. She looked up, her eyes curious. Yeah. Brian swallowed hard. Can we talk? Just us. Her brows lifted, but she nodded. Sure. They stepped out onto the porch, the winter air crisp against their skin. Brian shoved his hands into his pockets, searching for words that didn't sound like a bad rom-com script. I'm not great at this, he admitted. Lena smiled faintly. At what? Feelings, he said, grimacing. Talking about them, acting on them. Pretty much the whole emotional spectrum. Her lips curved. You're doing fine so far. Brian chuckled, then sobered. Look, I like having you here. More than I expected. And last night, it wasn't just dinner for me. Lena's breath caught. Brian, I'm not saying this to pressure you, he added quickly. You've been through hell. I get that. But I need you to know. I like you. And not just because you make the house feel less empty. Silence stretched between them, heavy and humming with something unspoken. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice low. I like you too. Brian blinked. You do. She nodded, her eyes shimmering with something fragile but fierce. But I'm scared. Brian stepped closer, his tone gentle. Of me. Of needing someone, she whispered. Of leaning on you and then losing everything again. Brian's chest tightened. He reached out, brushing his fingers against hers. A touch so light it felt like a promise. You're not going to lose me, he said softly. Not unless you want to. Her eyes locked on his, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just them. The porch, the cold air, and the quiet thrum of possibility. Then the door burst open. Daddy! Gina shouted, her tiara askew. The castle fell down. Brian laughed, stepping back as reality crashed in. Duty calls. Lena smiled, her cheeks flushed, her eyes brighter than he'd ever seen them. And as they walked inside, Brian knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was the start of something real. Chapter 10, The Storm Before the Calm. Brian had been expecting trouble. He just didn't know it would come knocking so soon. Started with a phone call. Lena was in the kitchen helping Maddie with a snack, and Brian was folding laundry when his phone buzzed. The number wasn't familiar, but something about it made his stomach tighten. He answered. Hello. A voice he didn't recognize. Male, sharp, and simmering with anger. Snapped through the line. Is Lena there? Brian's grip on the phone tightened. Who's asking? Her ex? The man spat. And you're the guy playing hero, huh? Brian's jaw clenched. If you've got something to say, say it. The man laughed, a sound that made Brian's skin crawl. Tell her she can't hide forever. She owes me. And if she thinks she can run off with my kid. Brian's voice dropped, calm but lethal. You're done talking. He hung up before the man could spew another word. For a moment, Brian just stood there, his pulse pounding. Then he walked into the kitchen. Lena looked up, her smile fading when she saw his face. What is it? Brian set the phone down, his tone steady but firm. Your ex called. Her breath hitched. What did he say? Brian met her eyes. Enough to make me want to throw my phone through a wall. Lena's hands trembled as she gripped the counter. He found me. Brian stepped closer, his voice low, controlled. You're safe here. He's not getting near you or Maddie. Her eyes shimmered with fear, and something else. Shame. Brian, I didn't want to drag you into this. He shook his head. You didn't drag me anywhere. I opened the door. I knew there might be baggage. Her laugh was bitter. Baggage? He's not baggage. He's a wrecking ball. Brian's jaw tightened. Then let him swing. He won't hit you. The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension. Lena tried to keep her voice light for Maddie's sake, but Brian saw the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. He hated it. The fear in her eyes, the weight pressing down on her shoulders. That night, after the girls were asleep, Brian found her on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, staring into the dark. Cold out, he said softly, stepping beside her. She didn't look at him. I should leave. Brian's chest tightened. No. Brian. No, he repeated, his voice firm. You're not running. Not from him. Not from this. Her breath hitched. You don't understand. He doesn't let go. Ever. Brian turned to face her, his gaze steady. Then he's never met someone who doesn't back down. Lena's eyes filled, her voice breaking. Why are you doing this for me? Brian reached out, gently taking her hands. Because I know what it feels like to be broken. And because I care about you, Lena. More than I should, maybe. But I'm not letting you fight this alone. Her lips parted, a whisper escaping. Brian. For a moment, the world narrowed to just them. The porch, the cold night, and the quiet thrum of something fierce and undeniable. Then Lena did something that stole Brian's breath. She stepped forward and rested her forehead against his chest. Brian froze, then wrapped his arms around her, holding her like he'd been waiting his whole life to do it. And in that moment, he knew, whatever storm was coming, he wasn't letting go. Chapter 11, Family in the Making. The next morning felt different. Not because the sun was brighter or the coffee tasted better, but because Lena smiled when she walked into the kitchen, and it wasn't the guarded, polite smile he'd seen before. It was real, soft, like someone who'd finally exhaled after holding their breath for too long. Brian was flipping pancakes because apparently that was now a permanent tradition, when Maddie and Gina burst in like twin whirlwinds. Daddy! Gina shouted, her tiara crooked. We have a plan. Brian raised a brow. Should I be worried? Yes, Lena said dryly, pouring herself coffee. The girls climbed onto chairs, their faces glowing with mischief. Maddie slapped a piece of paper on the table, a crayon masterpiece featuring stick figures, hearts, and what looked suspiciously like a wedding cake. Brian blinked. What is this? Gina grinned. Your wedding. Brian choked on air. My what? Lena nearly spit out her coffee. Girls? No, listen, Gina said, bouncing in her seat. You and Maddie's mommy like each other. We can tell. So we're making a wedding. Maddie nodded solemnly. With cake. And dancing. Brian stared at the paper, then at Lena, who was biting her lip so hard he thought she might draw blood. Her cheeks were pink, her eyes sparkling with barely contained laughter. Wow, Brian said slowly. That's ambitious. Gina crossed her arms. You can't say no. We already started planning. Brian rubbed his temples. Of course you did. The rest of the morning was chaos, the good kind. The girls raided the linen closet for wedding gowns, read pillowcases, turned the living room into an aisle, and demanded Brian wear a tie, because grooms wear ties. Lena tried to intervene, but every time she said, Girls, this isn't. Maddie would look up with those big brown eyes and say, Please, and Lena would melt like butter on a griddle. Brian wasn't much better. When Gina handed him a plastic ring from her toy box and declared, You have to give this to her, he laughed so hard he nearly cried. This is ridiculous, Lena whispered as they stood in the aisle, surrounded by stuffed animals serving as guests. Brian grinned. Ridiculous is kind of my specialty. Her lips curved, and for a moment, their eyes locked, long enough for Brian to feel something shift, something warm, something dangerous. The ceremony lasted 5 minutes, ending with Maddie shouting, You may hug the bride, and Gina clapping like a tiny wedding planner. Brian hugged Lena. Quick, light, but enough to make his pulse tick faster than he liked. Her hair smelled like vanilla and something he couldn't name, and for one insane second, he wondered what it would feel like to never let go. Then Maddie yelled, Kiss! And both adults jumped apart like guilty teenagers. Nope, Brian said quickly, his ears burning. Not happening. Lena laughed, a real unguarded laugh that made his chest ache in the best way. Later, when the girls were napping and the house was quiet, Brian found Lena in the kitchen, sipping tea. They're relentless, she said, smiling into her cup. Brian chuckled. They're 5. Subtlety isn't in their vocabulary. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged again, soft, humming with something unspoken. Brian swallowed hard, his voice low. For what it's worth, If they were older, they'd probably still be right. Lena's breath caught, her cheeks flushing. She didn't answer, but her smile said enough. And as Brian walked away, one thought burned in his mind. This house didn't feel empty anymore. Felt like home. Chapter 12, the truth comes out. Brian had always known this day would come. He just didn't expect it to arrive so soon. Or so suddenly. It started innocently enough. Lena was sitting at the kitchen table, coloring while Maddie built a tower of blocks nearby. Lena was rinsing dishes, humming softly, and Brian was enjoying the rare peace that came when two 5-year-olds were momentarily distracted. Then Gina spoke. "Daddy," she said, her voice casual, almost curious. "Why don't you and Mommy live together?" Brian froze, the question hitting him like a punch to the chest. He'd rehearsed this moment in his head for years, but somehow, the words felt heavier now that they were real. He glanced at Lena, who had gone still, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. Maddie looked up, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Brian set down his coffee slowly, turning to face his daughter. "That's a big question, Peanut." Gina shrugged, coloring a sun with bright yellow strokes. "Maddie's mommy lives with her. Why doesn't mine live with you?" Brian took a breath, steadying himself. He'd promised himself he would never lie to her. "Not about this. Because," he said gently, "sometimes grown-ups make choices that change things. Your mom and I, we had problems we couldn't fix." Gina frowned. "Like fighting?" Brian nodded. "A little, but mostly trust." Her brow furrowed. "What's trust?" Brian smiled faintly. "It's when you believe someone will always be honest with you. And when that breaks, it's hard to fix." Gina stared at her drawing for a long moment, then looked up. "Did Mommy break it?" Brian's chest tightened. He felt Lena's gaze on him, silent and steady. "Yes," he said softly. "She made choices that hurt our family. And that's why we don't live together anymore." Gina's lips trembled. "Does that mean you don't love her?" Brian shook his head. "I'll always care about her because she's your mom. But love is different." Gina was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "I'm glad you didn't leave me." Brian's throat burned. He crouched beside her, pulling her into his arms. "Never, Peanut. I'll never leave you." When Gina ran off to play, Brian stayed kneeling on the kitchen floor, his heart pounding. He felt Lena's presence before he saw her. "That was..." She began softly, then stopped, her voice thick. Brian stood slowly, meeting her eyes. "Harder than I thought." Lena nodded, her gaze shimmering. "You handled it beautifully." Brian exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've been waiting for that question for 2 years." Her lips curved faintly. "And now?" Brian looked toward the living room, where Gina and Maddie were laughing like nothing had happened. "Now I keep telling her the truth. No matter what." Lena's eyes softened, and for a moment, something passed between them. Something quiet, fierce, and undeniable. That night, after the girls were asleep, Brian sat on the porch, staring at the stars. Lena joined him, her steps light, her presence grounding. "She's lucky," Lena said softly. Brian glanced at her. "Who?" "Gina," Lena murmured. "To have a father who fights for honesty, who doesn't run." Brian's chest tightened. "I'm just trying to do right by her." Lena's gaze held his, steady and warm. "You're doing more than that." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the night air cool and still. Then Lena spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Maddie asks about her father, I don't know what I'll say." Brian reached out, his fingers brushing hers. A touch so light it felt like a promise. "You'll tell her the truth. And if you need help, I'll be here." Her breath caught, her eyes shimmering in the moonlight. And in that quiet, Brian realized something he'd been trying not to admit. He wasn't just protecting Lena. He was falling for her. Chapter 13, Happily Ever After with Laughter. Brian had never believed in fairy tales. Not after what life had thrown at him. But as he stood in his kitchen 2 weeks later, watching Maddie and Gina dance in mismatched socks while Lena laughed from the couch, he realized something. Fairy tales weren't about perfection. They were about second chances. The storm had passed. Lena's ex hadn't shown up. Thanks to a restraining order Brian helped her file, and a few firm conversations that made it clear she wasn't alone anymore. The tension that had hung over the house like a dark cloud had lifted, replaced by something lighter, something that felt like home. Brian poured coffee, leaning against the counter as he watched Lena. She was different now, still strong, still fierce, but softer around the edges. Her laughter came easier. Her shoulders didn't carry the weight of the world anymore. And every time she looked at him, Brian felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. "Daddy!" Gina shouted, spinning in a circle until she collapsed in a heap of giggles. "We're having a party." Brian grinned. "Looks like it." Maddie popped up, her hair sticking out in every direction. "You need to dance too." Brian raised a brow. "Do I?" "Yes," both girls yelled in unison, grabbing his hands and pulling him toward the living room. Lena laughed so hard she nearly spilled her tea. "Go on, hero. Show us your moves." Brian groaned dramatically. "Fine, but don't blame me if the house shakes." 5 minutes later, Brian was doing what could generously be called dancing while the girls shrieked with laughter. Lena clapped along, her eyes bright, her smile wide. And in that moment, amid the chaos, the laughter, the warmth, Brian realized something simple and undeniable. He didn't want this to end. When the girls finally collapsed in a giggling heap, Brian slipped out onto the porch, needing air and maybe courage. Lena followed a moment later, her steps light, her presence grounding. "Nice moves," she teased, leaning against the railing. Brian smirked. "I try." They stood in silence for a beat, the night air cool and still. Then Brian turned to her, his voice low, steady. "Lena, I don't want this to be temporary." Her breath caught. "Brian, I know we started as strangers. I know life's messy. But these last few weeks, they've been the best I've had in years. And not because of pancakes or superhero weddings, though those were pretty great." He smiled faintly. "Because of you." Lena's eyes shimmered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel the same." Brian stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Then let's stop pretending this is just survival. Let's make it something real." For a moment, the world narrowed to just them, the porch, the stars, and the quiet thrum of possibility. Then Lena smiled, a smile that felt like sunrise, and whispered, "Okay." Brian kissed her, soft, slow, like a promise. Inside, the girls peeked through the window, their faces glowing with triumph. "Told you," Gina whispered to Maddie. "They're a cute couple." Maddie grinned. "Now we can have a real wedding." Weeks later, the house was louder, warmer, and filled with laughter. Brian still made pancakes every morning. Lena still teased him about his dancing. And the girls? They were inseparable partners in crime, superheroes, wedding planners. Brian had thought his story ended 2 years ago. Turns out it was just the beginning. And as he sat on the porch one evening, Lena's hand in his, the girls chasing fireflies in the yard, Brian realized something simple and perfect. Happily ever after wasn't about fairy tales. It was about finding someone who made the broken pieces fit again, and laughing all the way there. Epilogue, Fireflies, and forever. The yard was alive with laughter. Maddie and Gina darted through the twilight, chasing fireflies that blinked like tiny stars against the darkening sky. Their giggles floated through the warm evening air, mingling with the soft hum of crickets. Brian sat on the porch steps, Lena beside him, her hand resting in his like it belonged there, because now it did. He watched the girls twirl in the grass, their pillowcase capes fluttering behind them, and felt something settle deep in his chest. Peace, joy, a sense of home he thought he'd lost forever. "You know," Lena said softly, her voice carrying that quiet strength he'd come to love, "I think they're happier than we are." Brian smiled, turning to her. "Not possible." She laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You really believe that?" He kissed her hair, breathing in the scent of vanilla and something that felt like hope. "I believe in this," he murmured. "In us." Lena's fingers tightened around his, and for a moment, the world felt simple. No storms, no shadows, just two people who had walked through fire and found something worth holding on to. Out in the yard, Gina shouted, "Daddy, Mommy, look, we caught forever." She held up a jar glowing with fireflies, her face lit with wonder. Brian chuckled, his heart swelling. "You sure did, Peanut," he called back. "You sure did." And as the night wrapped around them like a soft blanket, Brian realized something he'd never thought he'd feel again. Happily ever after wasn't a fairy tale. It was this porch, a jar of fireflies, two little girls laughing under the stars, and the woman beside him, his second chance, his quiet miracle, smiling like forever was finally theirs.